Hello. Hi. It's good to be back. If you've clicked on this not knowing who I am, I'm Jennifer. I do a lot of book-related things, one of which is making these videos on my favorite types of books. So I specialize in Central and Eastern European literature. I love reading from a range of time periods. When it comes to nonfiction, I love history and biography titles especially. My last video was in February, but I haven't been on a break. This was the plan. This is my new schedule. The idea is that every year I'll do a winter season and the summer season, and that way I won't have to come on here and add to the time-honored tradition of the YouTube burnout video. I'm trying to make this work, you know, I have a full-time job, I want to enjoy this. For my winter season, I put out 8 videos. I was over there making author spotlights and a Czech literature starter kit. I did a deep dive on The Unbearable Lightness of Being. I featured nonfiction on World War I. I loved it. More on World War I today. This summer season is going to be a smaller project. I have 4 videos planned. If you've watched my videos before, you'll notice that I'm in a different background. That's because I'm in a different state. Yeah, I've had some big life changes and I'll talk a little about those in an upcoming video, but today I really want to focus on 5 books that were special to me in the first half of the year. I have 3 novels and 2 nonfiction titles to talk about, and I'm working my way up to what's been far and away my favorite reading experience so far. First up, you guys, it's a new release. I don't know what to do with myself. I'm only a few months past full relevance here. This is a novel called The Pretender by Jo Harkin, which is set in the early Tudor period. And I know that I can trace my interest in Tudor-era England to the time as a teenager when I was reading Wolf Hall and watching the Showtime series, The Tudors, and I was like watching it on my family's desktop computer, so I had to be very strategic about when I was going to watch the sex scenes. You know, that era of the shared desktop when anybody could walk by. So Elizabeth I is the last and most famous of the Tudor line, closely followed in fame by her father, King Henry VIII. But his father, Henry Tudor, became King Henry VII by defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. That's when Henry's House of Lancaster defeated Richard's House of York, and it's the backdrop for this novel, which is Harkin's second. Her story focuses on a boy who's called Lambert Simnel. If you look up the historical figure, he was claimed as an Earl of the House of York and the rightful heir to the throne in place of Henry Tudor. And the circumstances of this real figure are so piecemeal and muddied in a way that Harkin really plays with. Basically, the protagonist is raised by humble folk on a farm before he's taken away to be trained as heir to the throne of England. And that's the heart of the novel's psychology. This young boy of many names and of ambiguous origins keeps being told that he should be king and he will be king once he takes his throne back from the pretender Henry VII. But where does any of this fit in with the divine right of kings? Because Henry took the throne, right? He would have argued that that was a judgment from God, that he should be king. But Lambert didn't grow up thinking of himself that way. He always imagined himself in the future as a farmer. So as he begins to move in more elevated circles, he has this disconnect where he's thinking, wouldn't I feel infused with this divine right if I really had it? Like, what does it mean that I have to be taught to feel like a king? The thing God supposedly wants me to be. So the book has these classic narrative outlines of a changing class and a confusion of personal identity. And one of my favorites is when there's a main character who's heart-wrenchingly innocent and good in a society that doesn't value goodness, where people can't conceive of a use for it. And within these trusty outlines, you have some really colorful creations of Harkin's, like the love interest Joan, who's a fantastic character. It's funny how the same things that someone else can find irritating in a writing style, you can find charming. And this style was so effective for me. I really felt the staccato rhythm of Harkin's writing and the humor, the salaciousness, the moments of pathos, it all hit. The same thing goes for her approximation of the language of the time, where she clearly isn't going for an exact representation of Tudor-era English, but she has so much of the flavor of the era with her choice of adverbs and the repetition of certain characteristic phrases. Again, I just found it charming. This is on the longish side at 470 pages, and I would say that the final section lacked the momentum of the earlier ones, and that's partly because of the plot and where it takes the characters. They themselves are just more stagnant. But I also attribute this kind of feeling to a situation where a character arc is both logical and unearned. When there are narrative gestures to how and why a character changes, but the execution is slightly off somehow. Yeah, there's some of that going on at the end of The Pretender, but I think that everything leading up to that is so successful, and those are the sections that are a lot more prominent in my mind when I think back on reading this. I found a much healthier balance of novels, and especially of new novels, in my reading, and I know that cutting back has seriously increased the joy I get from a book like this. It's increased how much it can stand out in my mind. But that also means I can't contextualize a brand new novel in the current landscape for those of you who are big readers of frontlist titles. And there's a lot of value in somebody being able to come on camera and do that. Shout out to frontlist booktubers. The two other novels on this list are both from the 1930s. So we jump from 2025 to 1933. This is The Oppermanns by Lion Feuchtwanger. He was a German Jewish writer, and I want to catch you up to speed on the plot first and then discuss what makes this special in an ocean of Nazi-related fiction. We follow a family of 4 siblings. The oldest is named Martin, and he runs the family furniture business, which was started about 60 years ago by their grandfather Emanuel Oppermann. He had the idea of selling fairly high-quality, standardized, affordable furniture, and the business has done very well. Oppermann furniture is a staple in German homes at the time we enter the scene. So we have Martin, who is running the business, like I said, and then the second brother, Edgar, is a world-renowned surgeon. Gustav is my favorite. He lives a life of ease as a kind of casual literary scholar, goals. And then there's Clara, the sister, who's married to a Jewish man from Eastern Europe named Jacques. And that creates these interesting conversations between the German Jewish family and their Galician brother-in-law. Because Jacques represents the Eastern European experience of Jews, he's much quicker than the rest of them to believe that the worst can happen. By the way, if you noticed that I introduced the sister by then introducing her husband, that's not a coincidence. There are a lot of female characters in here, and they're fine and they're interesting, but female characters aren't main characters in this novel. 20th century writing strikes again. The book takes place throughout the year 1933 as the National Socialist Party comes to power and as laws continue to change and become more restrictive for Jewish businesses to start. And we witness the transition period from this National Socialist ideology going from something that was considered vulgar and fringe and something that could be laughed at to then becoming the dominant and actually the only acceptable ideology in schools and in commerce and eventually in everyday social life. This was originally translated from German by James Cleugh. I'm not totally sure of the pronunciation, but the description box will have the name spelled out for clarity. And Joshua Cohen has revised that translation and written a really nice introduction that explains the publication history of the book. And what's extraordinary about this is that Feuchtwanger wrote it in real time from May to October of 1933. That's the real difference here in terms of what it has to offer. If you'd handed me a similar book and said it had been written in 1958 or 1987, I wouldn't have been that interested, I don't think. And that's because 1930s Germany is a case study I'm familiar with. And there are a lot of other case studies that are relatively untapped sources of wisdom in the English language world. But this isn't an author who was reconstructing these events and assessing them with the aid of hindsight. Feuchtwanger didn't have knowledge of the future, only of the present. He was observing what was happening then and there. And that's what makes it eerie and appallingly poignant. He was originally writing The Oppermanns as a screenplay, and you can see the influence of that in the short chapters that each present a discrete scene. And that format means that we enter the minds of a lot of different characters as they each begin to face situations that at first are unsettling, and which then become stressful and then difficult and then dangerous. The characters live with this uncertainty that reaches greater and greater heights until they reach a place of terrible certainty, a place where they can no longer convince themselves that everything will be fine. Feuchtwanger was a popular author. He has quite a straightforward, descriptive style, and his strength lies in his psychological portraits. Many of the characters begin the novel thinking, all right, things aren't great. I acknowledge that, but Come on, is something really bad gonna happen to me or to my family? I live in a reasonable country. I love my country. Why would I work myself up? Why are people like Jacques trying to alarm me? And Feuchtwanger has a real talent for observing all the subtle expressions of that thought process and how the rationalizations differ slightly from person to person. So yeah, this book was rough. Like really rough, but also companionable for me. It made me feel less alone. That's not worth much. It's not action of any kind. This was a bestseller in Germany in 1933, and much good that did, but that's at least how I felt. And I really like what McNally Editions is doing with their series of rediscovered titles. Moving to a nonfiction book, this one came out last year in the summer of 2024. It's Anne Applebaum's newest, called Autocracy Inc, The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. Let this be a sign that this list isn't getting any sunnier. Once we finish up with Autocracy, the last two titles are about your friend and mine, World War I. Anyway, in this very compact book, Applebaum is trying to adjust people's conceptions of today's dictators, how they work and what they want. I'll leave the first 2 to 3 pages on screen here if you want to pause, because she hits the ground running. In a few paragraphs, she's already outlined a lot of her major points. Before I get into the content, I want to talk about form, because this is a rare beast. It's a series of articles that works really well as a book. This is essentially an edited compilation of Applebaum's ongoing journalism on the subject of autocracies. And that type of thing is often a really unsatisfying experience in book form. In the earliest stages of the publishing process, when authors are pitching their nonfiction titles to prospective literary agents, those agents are often asking themselves, is this topic a book? Or is it an article? It can also happen where a single article is so successful that an agent or editor urges the author to make it into a book. So you might not have framed it to yourself in this exact way, but as a reader, there's a good chance that you've had the experience of reading a nonfiction book and thinking that a lot of it was filler, but not knowing why. And that's often why. It already was a bunch of articles, or it came from an article, or it only ever should have been an article, but it was stretched to assume book form. Autocracy Inc. doesn't have that problem though, and I think it's because it's intended to be a restrained general introduction. It works as a hybrid because it's not padded. It's the length it needs to be, and that happens to be the length of a short book. So I don't know, I just found that interesting. So back to autocracies, which are government systems with one person in power. And it sounds simple, but it encompasses different kinds of systems. So an absolute monarch is an autocrat, and a dictator is also an autocrat. Applebaum makes distinctions in her conversations of different countries, places like Russia and Belarus, Venezuela, North Korea, Iran, Hungary. She's not saying they're all using the same government system, but she's putting them under an analytical umbrella to make certain observations. For example, she says, unlike military or political alliances from other times and places, this group operates not like a bloc, but rather like an agglomeration of companies, bound not by ideology, but rather by a ruthless, single-minded determination to preserve their personal wealth and power. I think this is a useful framework if you've followed protests in one of these places and seen them fail. I often mention the 2020 protests in Belarus against the longtime dictator Alexander Lukashenko. That man just lives on and on and on. But it was a huge percentage of the Belarusian population that banded together to take to the streets and protest the latest round of rigged elections in 2020. And they were incredibly powerful scenes to watch. Powerful solidarity, peaceful mass protests, and they were brutally suppressed. And 5 years later, Lukashenko is still in power. You can look at that and say, well, he controls the police. And that's true, and that's a big factor. But Applebaum goes further than that to show how regimes like Lukashenko's prop one another up across geographic space and cyberspace. They support one another by creating structures of offshore wealth. They share surveillance technology. They share weapons. They benefit from the same styles of propaganda campaigns and by muddying information spaces generally. And they also have their own web of autocratic trade agreements. And these agreements allow a country like Russia to avoid total financial collapse, even as a number of wealthy countries have attempted to isolate it. Some of Applebaum's strongest points relate to the blind optimism of the late 90s and early 2000s. She says, amid all the discussion about China and Russia that took place in the 1990s, and despite all the debate about the economic impact that open borders might have on Western markets, almost no one spoke about the political impact on Western democracies. Everyone assumed that in a more open, interconnected world, democracy and liberal ideas would spread to the autocratic states. Nobody imagined that autocracy and illiberalism would spread to the democratic world instead. That insight stood out to me, that in an era when the US in particular had so much control, there was a concurrent truth that the US and countries like it overestimated that control. They didn't imagine a world where other geopolitical actors with other motivations could impact them and their societies in a way that would be hard to reverse. I've been thinking about a review of Applebaum's book before this one. It's called Twilight of Democracy, and the review is by the political scientist Ivan Krastev, whose writing I always appreciate. He framed her as an 89er, as someone who was shaped by the Eastern European revolutions of 1989 that tore down single-party communist rule. And they did it in a way that was mostly peaceful and triumphant. Krastev talks about the infectious idealism of that time, the assumption that the whole region would transition inexorably into free market liberal democracies. And some of his gentle critiques of her for that are counteracted by her arguments in Autocracy Inc. But you do feel the spirit of 1989 in that tension between Applebaum's grim analysis of the 21st century struggles of liberal democracies and a kind of optimism that's never fully left her, and actually she dedicates this book to the optimists, which makes it even more noticeable that she published it a few months before November of 2024, and that's the main reason for the general absence of Trumpism 2.0 in this equation. I don't know, man, there are fewer people to dedicate the book to than when she was writing it. This isn't the first or last word on present-day autocracies, and Applebaum herself wouldn't claim it is, because we're in an era of fantastic scholarship and journalism on every angle of this topic, but it is a really smart and succinct introduction to some of the larger stories to be told here. And I like that you don't have to be a geopolitics or international affairs person to get into this. Applebaum, as always, is a really assured guide through the thickets of tangled political dynamics. Once I finish filming, I'll be lending this book to my dad. Despair together, not apart. Back to the good old days, the 1930s. This next one is a Hungarian novel that was published in 1930 on the dot. It's The Rebels by Sándor Márai, or Márai Sándor for my Hungarian viewers. I try, but I'm sure my vowels are still all over the place. This was translated from Hungarian by George Szirtes, and I'm about to go to town on all the things that intrigued and excited me about this book. But before I do that, I want to flag that I know a lot of readers, and I struggle to think of somebody I would actually recommend this to. It's unevenly executed in a way that I think would affect the reading experience for most people, and its flaws affected my experience too, but here's why I loved it. It follows four boys who are reluctantly becoming men, and it's set in the late spring of 1918 in a Hungarian town called Kassa. The town itself hasn't been hit directly by the war in terms of battles, but all the men are gone, and those who do come back are wounded and changed in some fundamental way. Because the story doesn't focus directly on the Great War, it makes it that much more impactful when there are passages like the one describing the spring thawing of the river and how the bodies that have been frozen are thawed too and are carried on the current through the town. But mainly the war is the immediate future for our characters because they're boys who are about to graduate from school and who expect to be sent to the front afterwards. And in this last period of childhood, they rebel against the adult world, which they see as preposterous and remote and unsavory. The adult characters in here are unsavory and weak and selfish. So the four friends start stealing things, useless things, and hoarding them, and they come up with these elaborate games. They perform a kind of ritual storytelling for one another. The narrator calls it their second childhood because they're playing on the edge, playing in a way that could have serious adult world consequences, but that's not the way it feels to them. Fur all over the place. The main character is named Abel. How's that for representation of a slaughtered generation? 3 of the boys have a fixation on one of their crew named Tibor, and Abel especially has these homoerotic feelings about how beautiful and how effortlessly right Tibor is. It made me think of John Knoll's novel A Separate Peace. And there's also a class dynamic embedded in the character of Tibor that becomes important to the plot. There's also a funny detail to the setup where the 4 boys don't really like one another. I don't want to overgeneralize by gender, but it did make me think of certain friendships that both my brothers have, where it's like, why was that guy invited to your wedding? Like, do you even like him? Does anybody in the group like him? But I guess he's part of the gang. Like I said, though, this is a real hit or miss early novel experience. Márai published it in 1930, and his better and best-known novel, Embers, was published in 1942. So there's a fair amount of experimentation going on in here, and it's clunky at times. 2 of the jacket blurbs call this darkly comic, and I disagree. I don't think it's comic whatsoever, but it does have elements of a carnival. There's this luxurious climactic theater scene where they're all fully immersed in embodying characters. And even as I could see how significant this scene was symbolically, I was also thinking, this feels long to me. And I'm a very patient reader. I'm typically trying to find the author's wavelength instead of imposing my own. It takes a lot to bore me, so if I'm feeling bored in the most critical scene, I do think that tells you something. But when you love an author, you know, their misses are instructive. It's like you can see their workings more clearly than you can in their better books. And there's so much about this novel that just clicked for me personally. It's time for the big one. My favorite book of 2025 so far is Margaret MacMillan's Paris 1919, 6 Months That Changed the World, which was published in 2001. Holy shit, I think so highly of this book. I'm feeling so overwhelmed by how selective I have to be in the format of this kind of video. So I'm going to take as my inspiration Paris 1919, which is a whole world in 500 pages. And that's almost literal because this is about the Paris peace talks following the end of the Great War in November of 1918. From roughly January to June of 1919, there were 3 main players who met in Paris to write up the various post-war agreements. So you have Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, and Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister. You also have the Italian Prime Minister, Vittorio Orlando, who wasn't as influential as the others, but together they formed the Council of Four. There were a host of other players here too. There were diplomats and subject matter experts, all manner of advisors who came with their delegations to Paris and transformed the city for the first half of that year. But Wilson, Lloyd George, and Clemenceau were the main authors of this piece, and the process of getting these treaties down on paper was agonizing and involved so much bitter compromise and genuine camaraderie and fights, grown men screaming accusations at each other. Fiction could never. Like, if you like drama, if you like mess, the Paris peace talks are going to hit the spot for you. I'm going to try to talk about things most of you will care about first. So I'm going to talk about the content, and then I do want to get into questions of form, because that's what I like thinking about with nonfiction. I like thinking about the basic structural choices an author makes. Yeah, I guess I am calling my own analysis basic, but I think it helps with nonfiction. I think people feel pressured to make it elaborate or to think they have to be making a specific historiographical argument when you can start by returning to the basics, you know? One of MacMillan's later books is about the lead up to the war. It's called The War That Ended Peace. Now, I have flippantly referred to the Paris treaties as the peace that ended peace, and MacMillan is intent on challenging that kind of flippancy. She's complicating and in some cases dispelling myths about the peace process, and especially myths surrounding the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed by a vanquished Germany on June 28th of 1919. MacMillan mostly focuses on Germany, within in one compact section of this book, but she comes back around to it in the end to reiterate that she does not think the historical record supports the notion that the Treaty of Versailles was particularly hard on Germany, or that it was a leading cause of World War II. She's completely no nonsense about this, like just not having it, which is fascinating. MacMillan highlights the ignorance and the arrogance of the three main players when events demand. There's this great quote from Arthur James Balfour, a British statesman, who said, "I have three all-powerful, all-ignorant men sitting there and partitioning continents with only a child to take notes for them." This was exacerbated too because Lloyd George, in particular, was known for just coming out with things like, who are the Slovaks again? Like, why do we care about them? Who are they? Where are they? And MacMillan shows how representatives of new or aspiring states tried to use the council's ignorance to their own advantage. But she's far less interested in individual failings than she is on the general external restrictions on these men. She's not really asking, where did the peace fail? Or how did these men screw it all up? What she's asking is, what were the constraints that led to such varied outcomes in the peace process? To give you a quick and dirty list, you had the fact that Britain and France historically didn't trust each other and didn't have a legacy of working together to this extent. So that alliance was shaky before, during, and after the Great War. There were all these secretive, shady wartime agreements from 1915 and 1916, which were periods when the Allies had very little confidence that they would win the war. And now those chickens were coming home to roost in the most inconvenient of ways. There was the minor problem of Russia, a former ally that had fallen apart at the seams with the revolution of 1917 and was now stabbing royal children with bayonets in a basement. Certifiably not great things happening over there, just a touch of chaos. And the peacemakers had no idea how to factor a potentially Bolshevik Russia and its influence into their new picture of Europe and the Caucasus. In some cases, there were these knock-on effects where the council agreed on Czechoslovakia's borders, and then Romania's and Yugoslavia's, and then was like, so, okay, turns out Hungary has now lost 2/3 of its territory. And it was a defeated country, but mainly we made these other territory agreements without considering them from a Hungary-centric perspective. So a big factor in the early 20th century was the press. At home and in Paris, journalists got endless stories out of the peace process. They really did influence certain elements of how the peace proceeded and then of how it was interpreted after the fact. Then there were the competing home interests that each of these leaders were trying to manage. Interests in terms of the general population and in terms of their governments at home. They needed their people broadly to feel good about the peace in order to accept it and celebrate it. Maybe the most interesting dynamic of all is that this was a period of both imperial and diplomatic transition. The world was slipping, and not so gradually, from the clutches of men like Lloyd George and Clemenceau and Wilson, especially because in the aftermath of the war, Britain and France were so compromised comparatively. They simply didn't have the men and the military supplies and the money to continue exerting the kind of control over disparate parts of the world that they had before the war. And then you have the figure of Woodrow Wilson, who embodies so many of the contradictions of the time. He's the ultimate transitional figure in a way. He came to Paris with his 14 points in hand, his ideas for how to create a better and more collaborative international world order, which in a tale as old as time made it only more dramatic whenever he compromised on those very public ideals of his. If you have Woodrow Wilson biography recommendations, please leave them in the comments. You guys tend to be an absolute treasure trove of recommendations. There was a part of this book that made me well up with unexpectedly strong emotions. It was the part describing the determined sense of hope following the war. This feeling of resolve that something had to be learned and gained from this, that the scale of the devastation and the loss and the waste could mean something if it led to a better world and a more just peace than what came before it. These voices don't come across as crazy dreamers. It's actually beautiful the way Macmillan portrays them, and desperately sad, of course, to read that perspective from a 21st century vantage point. But in that pocket of reading, at least, it did make me feel like goodness matters, whether or not it ever ultimately prevails. Okay, a brief chat about form here, because I always approach nonfiction by first thinking about structure and priorities. This is a survey book, and the survey form is tricky for subject matter experts especially. I mean, if you don't know that much, just write what you know and you'll probably end up with a survey book. But Macmillan is a professional historian. She's Canadian. She has mostly taught at the University of Toronto and at Oxford. And historians are trained to question and to qualify everything, or at least to be able to do so. So of course she has to be selective about the knowledge she presents, right? If you've read books like The Guns of August or The Sleepwalkers, or if you've watched my reviews on those books, then I would say Paris 1919 has a more classic survey structure than either of those. It's less narratively driven than the Tuckman, and it's more pared down to the essentials than the Clark. Macmillan also orders her story more by topic than by timeline. Topics are the main organizing principle. She balances the need to simplify and the need to complicate by simplifying all the background information leading up to the conference and then complicating the details of the conference itself. That's how she manages to do both. And it's fair at this point if you're like, okay, so you're saying that she focuses on the topic of the book. Groundbreaking. But really, it's a delicate balance because you do have to cover a lot of nuanced historical and biographical information leading up to 1919 before you can even begin to take it from there. So the question is, what proportion of the book should exposition be? If this were written like The Sleepwalkers, each chapter would be more around the 50-page mark instead of the mostly 20 to 30 pages that Macmillan favors, which has three main effects. And the first is the gap it creates between specialists and generalists. In a section like the one on the transition from the Ottoman Empire into modern-day Turkey, I was holding on for dear life to every piece of information she gave me. And from that perspective, I thought she was both detailed and efficient in getting me up to speed. But if you're a specialist in any part of this, your sections will have countless Easter eggs, throwaway sentences that are dissertation worthy, clauses that are whole fields of study. So that's the first main effect of the compression. It's the winks and nudges to specialists while she's shepherding generalists along. The second effect of this is that she does use certain serviceable, conventional narratives without interrogating them. True to form, my pet peeve here is that she treats the Austro-Hungarian Empire like the doddering old man of Europe that was destined to disintegrate regardless of the Great War. Why do so many historians transform into counterfactualists only where Austria-Hungary is concerned? Where's my man Chris when I need him? But the third effect of this background simplification, and the most interesting, is that it replicates the feel of the peace talks themselves. Because the truth is, the sheer volume of topics covered in Paris was almost unfathomable. And you begin to viscerally understand the demands on these leaders through your experience of the book itself. I would say that I've always been more drawn to other subtopics within the World War I sphere, but I don't know. This might be the start of my diplomacy era, you guys. I'd love to read more about these peace talks and about the process of peace treaties generally, and that wasn't something I expected at all coming in. I thought that I would read this and appreciate it and then return to my other areas, you know? So, I know that was a lot, but overall, I really recommend Paris 1919 to a general readership, and that includes people who don't often read history titles. It's incredibly readable, and it's about the very formation of the modern world. Highly recommended. Yay! Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon for another video.